Hello, welcome to the Talking Michigan Transportation Podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Cranson. As you know, if you live in Michigan or really just about anywhere, wildlife crossings for highways and other roads is a huge safety concern, not just for the animals, but for humans and the toll it takes. You can certainly measure this in the costs of repairs to vehicles and hospitalizations and the cost of dealing with animal carcasses that's borne by various road agencies. So lots of people have tried some creative things. Today, I'm going to talk with Tim Johnson, who is a landscape connectivity specialist with the Yellowstone to Yukon Conservation Initiative, that's known as Y2Y. They've done some really innovative things in western states and the western provinces of Canada to incentivize wildlife to use safe crossings, bridges, or tunnels that they create, obviously using fences to guide them in that direction. The Biden administration and Secretary of Transportation, Pete Buttigieg, have also incentivized states to apply for grants aimed specifically at this that were part of the bipartisan infrastructure law. MDOT is applying for one of those, hopefully to implement some things for the wildlife that cause some of the biggest problems or are often the victims of these encounters with vehicles on Michigan roadways. So we'll talk about how things have worked out west, what they've learned from it, and more. I hope you enjoy the conversation. Tim Johnson, thank you for taking time out of what I know is a busy schedule out west doing important work. Let's talk first a little bit. I introduced this segment as you doing the wildlife crossing kind of landscape planning for Y2Y, Yellowstone to Yukon. Can you just talk first about what that organization is?
Yeah, absolutely. So Y2Y, the Yellowstone to Yukon Conservation Initiative, we are a transboundary conservation organization that looks to keep landscapes connected and protected in what's essentially one of the most intact mountain regions left on the planet. So, the fates that have befallen other iconic mountain ranges, like the Andes, the Himalaya, the Y2Y region is unique in the sense that it's sort of this 3,400 kilometer long stretch of the spine of North America, essentially from Yellowstone up to the Yukon. It still has the full suite of mammals that were on the landscape sort of in the pre-European arrival time, I guess. So it's also, home to many iconic national parks. It's the watershed that provides source waters for millions of people in Canada and the US. And so we're the only organization that's dedicated to this landscape on a grand scale. And a big part of keeping that landscape connected and protected is finding ways for wildlife to cross roads and highways. It's part of keeping wildlife alive and thriving, and it's also a human safety issue in that these projects to get animals across the road help reduce wildlife vehicle collisions as well too. So for my work with the landscape connectivity team at Y2Y, a lot of my time is spent on looking at solutions to get animals across busy highways, and being based here in Canmore, Alberta, we're right next door to Banff National Park, which is probably the most known and most studied example of a network of fencing and crossings that's had a real impact on improving wildlife populations and human safety.
Yeah, and that's how it first got on my radar long before I worked for a DOT. I was out there skiing in the Banff area, Lake Louise, both downhill and cross country, where there's just beautiful cross country skiing right off the highway. And I saw those crossings in the late 90s, and I thought then, wow, what an innovative idea. And since then, since I've been at MDOT, some people who are really focused on this, not necessarily the same species, although, we do have elk and moose and black bears in Michigan. A lot of the focus is on smaller animals like turtles, which can often be the victims of crossing roads because, as you know, they don't go very fast. So I always thought it was pretty cool. And our environmental folks feel like they're a little late to the game, but they're hoping to get one of the grants made available in the bipartisan infrastructure law that have gone to other states, including some big ones to the state of Wyoming, which I'm sure you're familiar with since Yellowstone is one of the Ys. Could you talk about how you know that these crossings work?
Sure, yeah. So Banff, again, kind of being this really unique kind of iconic test pilot program to implement fencings and crossings. And so a big part of the Banff project was monitoring. So being a national park, obviously one of the mandates of Parks Canada is maintaining and conserving, biodiversity and healthy wildlife populations, and recognizing that the Trans-Canada Highway, which cuts right through the park, was having a real impact on wildlife populations and also a real impact on motorist safety. For example, the first sort of easternmost stretch of Highway 1 as it comes into Banff National Park, just west of where I am in Canmore, that first stretch to the town of Banff, it's about 22 kilometers, and there was on average over 100 collisions, mostly with elk and deer every year. So a real impact on wildlife populations and a real danger to motorists driving through the park. So the idea of creating this network of fencings and crossings really was aimed at meeting Parks Canada's mandate related to ecological integrity and biodiversity and healthy wildlife populations, but soon realized that there's a human element to it as well too. So in Banff, that sort of first stretch of crossings that was put in really was mostly a network of underpasses connected to wildlife fencing. So the fencing funneling wildlife to these crossings. And that sort of first phase had a real impact on reducing collisions in that stretch of road. And the initial way to monitor these crossings is that Parks Canada biologists and researchers would go to these underpasses and kind of rake out these sandy areas that they put down to be able to capture wildlife footprints. And every couple of days they would go out and record the footprints and tracks that they were seeing, and then rake it out again, and then do this every once in a while. And eventually got to putting in wildlife monitoring cameras. And so the camera program in Banff, over time has captured nearly 300,000 recorded crossings of wildlife using these underpasses, and then later the overpasses that were put in starting in the mid 1990s. And so through the camera monitoring, we know that the crossings work, and we know that each animal that uses one of these bridges or one of these tunnels under Highway 1 is one less animal that's trying to cross the road and risking its life, and risking the safety of motorists that potentially are hitting these deer or elk or bear or moose. So I think Banff is just a really good example of like a connected network. The whole system in Banff is just over 80 kilometers from the park's western gate, where it meets Yoho Park in BC, to the eastern boundary near Canmore. That stretch of road now has 38 underpasses and 6 overpasses, all connected with fencing. And as I said, the camera monitoring has shown that it's recorded hundreds of thousands of wildlife crossings. So a real success story, and it's sort of become a well-studied example. We got people from around the world coming to Banff to learn about how the crossings were, how the idea was generated, how money was raised for it, how they're implemented, some of the adaptive monitoring to modify the fencing and things like that to keep animals that like to dig from getting under. That was one of the first issues, that some animals would dig under the fence. So modifying the fencing to prevent the diggers from getting on the highway. But it's probably the most known example in the world of how a network of fencing paired with crossings can work to help wildlife and to keep motorists safer.
So I know you're not necessarily an animal behaviorist, but I tend to think that these large mammals are probably smarter than we tend to give them credit for. Do you think they learn, and even without the fence, at some point they would go to those crossings because they figured out that that's just a good, safe, efficient way to get over?
Yeah, I think first of all, talking about animals using crossings without a fence directing them to it, there is some evidence of that. Like there's some sites outside the national park where wildlife are often using, drainages that potentially have a culvert or a small bridge going under a highway. Often these drainages, because they're maybe less vegetated, provide easier passage for animals. And so if they're sort of taking the easiest route from A to B across the landscape and following a drainage, that may lead them to a bridge or a culvert under a highway. But it's really the fencing that's key to directing animals to these crossings. And there is a learning curve for sure. Like certain species will tend to use these structures oftentimes before they're even finished being built. I know probably the most recent example was State Highway 21 in Idaho, where an overpass was being constructed, and their monitoring cameras were capturing deer and elk using the crossing even before it was finished being constructed. That same thing happened on I-90 in Washington State. So some animals that are, maybe more habituated to human presence, deer and elk in Banff National Park, for example, often use these crossings quite quickly, and especially when the fence is directing them to them, we'll use them almost immediately as soon as they're open for business. Other animals are a bit more wary. Cougars, wolves, bears, especially female grizzlies with cubs, can take up to 5 years to be comfortable using a crossing. And so there is a learning curve for certain animals, but for the most part, in terms of the number of animals that are most likely to get hit being these ungulate populations here in Alberta, they show generally pretty quick uptake on using these crossings.
So have you found that attitudes and perceptions have changed in the 30 years since this? I ask because when MDOT first introduced a fence to protect some turtles on the western shore, western Michigan shore of Lake Michigan on a busy road there that happened to run near a very big river, so there were a lot of turtles crossing, and it was grandstanded by some politicians as a big waste of money, and you can't fix potholes, but you can do this, missing the environmental importance of it, and really I think turning into a bit of a surprise at how much people love turtles and the backlash that was created against those opponents. I know the western provinces at least have some parts, like Alberta, that are more conservative than the eastern. Did you ever get any kind of grief like that from anybody grandstanding on the issue?
I would say it's less common. Wildlife crossings and investment in them seem to be a fairly nonpartisan issue that has pretty broad public support. Occasionally there's pushback from, say, hunters or anglers that are worried that a fence is going to cut off access to their favorite spot to go and fish or hunt. But human access gates can often be part of these projects to allow continued access to parts of the landscape. But overall, I think in general, crossings enjoy broad support, and especially when you can make the case that by reducing collisions, you're sort of reducing the burden on society of the very significant and real costs that come from hitting animals. And, even with the smaller species, the turtles, the snakes, in Waterton National Park, a few hours south of here, there's a crossing that's dedicated to a threatened salamander species. So it's not necessarily all about, the big animals that are sort of the more obvious threat to human safety. And especially when you can get departments of transportation and departments of fish and wildlife working together and sort of recognizing that both of them have goals that are met by these crossings, whether it's improving motorist safety or improving conservation of biodiversity and keeping threatened or endangered species alive. But even the smaller animals can still pose a threat to motorists, especially if it's a 2-lane highway and someone's swerving to suddenly avoid a turtle that they see in the road. There's a very real possibility of a collision with an oncoming vehicle. So yes, hitting a large animal is probably the most common and likely risk, but there are dangers too from motorists, reacting to whatever they see in the road and potentially swerving or changing lanes quickly, and that can lead to collisions as well too. But I think it's really important to recognize that, the crossings are about, trying to keep wildlife populations healthy as much as they are about keeping motorists safe.
It's if you just focus on the turtles, they're all part of an ecosystem, right? Things get out of balance. So it's important that we try to protect them all, great and small. But I'm glad you brought up that point about motorists swerving, because something else that goes on and has gone on roadways near waterways in Michigan is that people pull off to try to help the animals across, and that creates its own dangers. So
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, definitely.
Stay with us. We'll have more on the other side of this important message.
Hey, did you see that sign on the side of the road? What about those workers? Are you even paying attention to how you're driving? Work zone awareness takes all of us.
So talk about how different animals use the crossings. There's all kinds of species that you're talking about. So
I mean, I guess in Banff, it's, as I mentioned, there's a mix of underpasses and overpasses. The overpasses generally being the largest structures. The ones in Banff are typically around 50 meters in width. And that type of width is really important in the sense it allows you to kind of create landscaping and to create a ground cover that will make more wary species like grizzly bears, wolves, cougars sort of comfortable with using those crossings. And then there's other animals that sort of prefer the cozier, narrow, darker confines of, say, a small culvert running under the road. So I think sort of having a mix of structure sizes and locations is really key. A lot of the sort of best investments and sort of the low-hanging fruit in terms of costs are using existing highway bridges or culverts and adding slight modifications to make them more amenable to wildlife passage can be a really low cost opportunity to use an existing structure versus building something brand new. I think, like black bears generally are going to use the tunnels and the overpasses. Grizzlies, especially with cubs, tend to favor just the overpasses and look for that more sort of broad crossing pathway to get safely across. And then deer and elk, again, typically will use the larger structures. Often that's just related to their size, especially the males with antlers and everything. A narrower culvert may not work for them. But yeah, a variety of widths is going to see different uses by different species. One thing in Banff too, the research there found that a lot of opposition to these crossings says, that they may function as a prey trap and that, wolves are just going to hang out and decimate the deer population. But that's. I
was going to ask you about that because I wondered about ambushes at the ends of these tunnels, and I was thinking about the wily wolves in particular.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that's generally, again, Banff being this sort of long-term case study has disproven that idea that crossings function as prey traps for predators. There's not a lot of evidence that happens.
It's not like a bear would stand by a little, waterfall in a river where salmon run, right?
Right, yeah.
So talk about why this matters as much to humans as to animals. You hit on that a little bit with, even the fear of people swerving for turtles. But I think that should seem obvious and be self-evident, but I don't know that it always is to people. So can you talk a little more about that?
Yeah. I think, in the West where you have a lot of deer and elk populations, and from reading the abstract USAN, I know deer is a huge issue in Michigan as well too. But, wildlife collisions here in Alberta outside the national park, they account for 60% of recorded collisions in the province. So it's a big problem, and it does have a real cost. I think researchers have estimated that the average cost of hitting a deer in 2020 US dollars is around $14,000 in terms of vehicle repair and injuries and fatalities and insurance claims. And then there's like the passive use costs of, say, the value of having that animal on the landscape, whether it's for hunting or just for having animals that people, tourists come to see the Rockies or come to see parts of Michigan, I'm sure. And, it's great. It's a great thing to be able to see a deer or moose. So if you add up those direct costs of $14,000 and the passive costs of $5,000, the average cost of hitting a deer is around $20,000. Elk is about $75,000, a moose over $110,000. So these are very real costs to society that everyone is sort of paying for through insurance costs and, other monetary figures. So if you can figure out where animals are crossing, where they're getting hit, having the data to be able to put these crossings in the best locations, you can really make a case that they are saving money in the long term, that they're types of infrastructure that pay for themselves over time. So I think, I've had the unfortunate incident of hitting a coyote, and it was totally unavoidable. It was just sprinting across the highway, and luckily it's it's a smaller creature, so it didn't really do a whole lot of damage. But it's traumatizing, and I think anyone that's hit an animal will definitely share that it's a very traumatic experience. But in certain parts of Alberta and all through the U.S. as well too, in various states, I think the chances of hitting a deer are quite high. So anything that can be done to keep animals alive and keep them from sprinting across the road, especially at nighttime. That's a huge issue with deer out west here in areas that are unfenced. And it's really hard to react in time. So crossings and fencing sort of statistically are the best known solutions to mitigate this problem.
So I know you had mentioned that you were relatively new to Alberta and the Banff National Park area when these things were first installed, and talking to some of the people involved in this for a number of years. Do you know what has maybe surprised them most? What did they learn that that took them by surprise from what they might have expected?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think maybe one of the learnings was how quickly animals adapt to these new structures. And also, I think for Banff, especially looking at, rarer species like grizzly bears or wolverines, how important these structures were at keeping these animals moving across a broad landscape that they need to survive and thrive. And so I think, the collaring of grizzly bears and following their movements through the landscape showed researchers that animals use huge areas and that roads are often a barrier to allowing them to reach their full potential in terms of finding mates and an adequate habitat to live their lives. So I think the Banff example really gave a huge foundational research as to how animals move across a very broad landscape that may not have been known otherwise when they were getting hitting this barrier wall essentially of a very busy highway, preventing them from moving across their full ranges. And I mentioned a bit earlier some of the adaptive management, like, figuring out ways to keep the diggers from getting under the fence. I think, most projects now will include sort of a chain link apron that extends underground about 2 meters on the inside of the fence. So that keeps animals that like to dig from being able to dig under. And then in Banff as well, too, certain areas, they're finding that black bears are actually climbing the fence. So they've put low voltage electric wire on the inside of the fence. That's sort of another adaptive piece that they've learned over time.
So that's probably pretty similar to what's used on farms for agricultural uses in terms of a hot wire fence.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So just a single wire running along the inside, and that's kept the numbers of bears climbing the fence down to a much lower number. Yeah, I guess, overall, I think just the number of animals that use these crossings was really surprising, just in the sense of, having a real robust data capture system with these crossings and having cameras at each location really provided a breadth of data that wasn't there before these crossings were up, showing where animals were moving and actually how many of them there were using these crossings.
There's a lot of beautiful things to see between Banff and Lake Louise on that stretch of road, but I think one of the coolest things I always remember and enjoy because I'm there in the wintertime is to see these elk basking in the sun, sitting in the snow just a little ways from the freeway, looking at humans like, why are you taking my picture?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's a huge part of the Banff experience is seeing the elk herds out. And in the summer months, we saw 3 grizzlies yesterday just driving home from a camping trip. So it's really cool. It definitely is a part of the, why people come to the Rockies, and that experience of seeing the elk hanging out in some of the aspen groves in the winter, just on the opposite side of the fence is, pretty special.
Yeah, and I guess the reason I don't see grizzlies on the trips where I've been there is because they're probably sleeping, right?
Yeah, you bet. Yeah, they're sort of going into their dens in mid to late October, usually sort of around 7,500 feet elevation. So kind of right now feeding in the valleys and getting ready for the winter months ahead.
Well, Tim, thanks a lot for talking about this. I think the success that you've had is really helping the states that are applying for these grants, including Michigan, and it gives them a lot to, base their applications on. And, we can show that there are really tangible results from this that do benefit humans, both in terms of safety and in terms of the hit to their wallet. So this is all great information.
Yeah, well, fantastic. And I really appreciate you inviting me on to chat. And because we work sort of cross boundary, I'm getting more and more up to speed on what's going on the U.S. side of things. But I think, the funding that's provided by that infrastructure bill is definitely a good opportunity for states to advance some of these projects. And I know YWI has written letters of support for several partners in Wyoming and Montana to tap into some of this funding. So, great to see. And maybe catch up on our skis sometime if you're ever out this way again. Keep in touch.
Oh yeah, that'd be great. I'll definitely I'll look you up when I get to the park gate for sure.
All right, Jeff.
Thanks, Tim.
Okay, take care.
I'd like to thank you once more for tuning in to Talking Michigan Transportation. You can find show notes and more on Apple Podcasts or Buzzsprout. I also want to acknowledge the talented people who help make this a reality each week, starting with Randy Debler, who skillfully edits the audio, Jesse Ball, who proofs the content, Courtney Bates, who posts the podcast to various platforms, and Jackie Salinas, who transcribes the audio to make it accessible to all.